Hi guys, my name is Karthik and I am from executeautomation.com and welcome to another video of developing microservices with aspnetcore 6.0 with minimal API. And this video will be talking about repository pattern in entity framework. So we already discussed about entity framework and how we can use entity framework for data retrieval, but there are many better ways to actually use the data retrieval itself. And one of the best known way to do it is using the repository pattern. Repositories are classes or components that encapsulates the logic required to access data sources. They centralize common data access functionalities, providing the better maintainability and decoupling the infrastructures or technologies used to access the database from the domain layer. And that's what I really mean in here, because if you remember in our earlier videos, we use entity framework as a domain layer to retrieve the data using the link and stuff, and that's exactly what we're going to be replacing. Instead of using the whole DB context that we used, the employee DB context that we used in our earlier videos, we are going to decouple that to use a more better approach, which is using the repository pattern. Instead of using the whole concrete implementation, we are going to be using just the interface of it. So the code change that we are really talking about over here using repository pattern is going to look something like this. As you can see, if you remember in our earlier videos, we were using the employee DB context directly within our APIs or the controllers, something like this, and we also did the business logic like making the put employee, post employee, and get employees directly on that particular controller, which is not the right way of doing it basically, because if your entity framework is going to change, if you're going to be using some other technologies in future, probably you might be seeing these methods will be obsolete, or you might be ending up changing the whole code. So better to keep that whole logic of the entity framework separated into a separate file. Like instead of using the concrete file, we'll just use the interface of it, something like this. As you can see over here, this is more neat. We are using a iData repository interface, which is going to be basically being implemented by the entity framework. But as you can see over here, we are going to just use that get employees, add employees, put employees, something like this, like a method, but it is going to perform basically the same operation that you're seeing on the left hand side. So the way we are going to do it is using the repository pattern. As I told you, the code is going to look something like this. So this data repository class is basically the concrete implementation of the employee DB context, and it's going to have all the implementation like get employees, put employees, and add employees, something like that. So all those things are going to sit into this particular class file, and the iData repository is going to look something like this. And this interface is going to be implemented by any concrete class in future where you might be using some other technologies to retrieve the data instead of just using entity framework in future. So that way we could achieve this whole data retrieval using repository pattern even for the entity framework that we are using in our microservice. So let's quickly see everything in action. So for that, I'm going to jump into my Visual Studio IDE. So this is the same code that we have been working so long within our series so far. And as you can see over here, we have all the implementation sitting straight away into this particular controller class, which is not the right way of doing it. And the more and more you put the implementation detail into the controller, the more complex it is for maintainabilities and stuff. And also, if you're going to be doing the testability of this particular service, it is also going to be very hard, because you might need to isolate the implementation and you might need to do the unit testing of that particular implementation. Then you might need to have like a interface to actually use that for testing purpose, and even this kind of things is not going to be really helpful for you to do the unit testing and mocking testing and stuff like that. So in order to isolate that particular stuff, we are going to create the what is called as a repository, and I'm going to create a new class file, and I'm going to call this as the data repository, pretty much like how we saw on the slide. And within this particular data repository, as you can see, I'm going to actually create a constructor which is going to basically call the employee DB context or something like this. And probably I'm going to call this as DB for simplicity purpose. And I'm going to hit control dot, and I'm going to create and assign a field, something like this. And this is what we're going to be using within our code over here. And you will see that the code change is going to be very easier. So for example, if I want to get the employees, so this is what the code is actually doing, right? Like return db employee dot to list. So I'm just going to copy this particular piece of code, and then I'm going to write a method over here, something like public list of employee, which is going to be get employees. Smart enough. And then I'm just going to return this employee dot to list. So I'm going to use the expression body, remember, and the code looks even more smaller. So this is how I'm going to get the employees details. And for example, if I'm going to put the employee, so I'm going to probably copy this particular whole code, and then I'm going to write the logic over here. So public list of all the employee, put employees, or put employee probably, and I'm going to pass the employee as the parameter over here into this particular method, and I'm going to put this guy over here. That's it. This is the only thing that I will be doing. Probably, I think over here I'm returning that particular employee, so it's not going to be a list of employee. I'm going to get rid of this list over here, and this method looks happy. That's for the put employee. And then we're going to do what is called as a add employee. So I'm just going to do public, and then I probably think it's going to be a list of all the employees, and I'm going to say add employee, and I'm going to pass the employee over here. And for the add employee, I'm just going to copy this code and I'll paste it over here. That ends our implementation. So you can see that we are putting all the implementations over here, and we have written exactly the same code that is sitting over here, which is cool. And now the next quest is we need to actually write an interface out from this particular concrete class, so that I could be able to use that particular interface within my code over here. So for doing that, you can just hit control dot, and you can see there is something called as extract interface option. So if you just select this, it will tell you what type that you're going to be creating. So I'm going to say I data repository. So let me do that, and it will also show you all the methods that you could able to extract from this particular concrete class to an interface. So it brings you up that guy. And if I hit control dot, or maybe just go to that class interface directly, you can see it has extracted everything for us, which is quite cool. So tomorrow, if you have some other data repository, and if you want your controllers to use that particular same implementation, like add employee, get employee, and put employee, but you're going to use a different mechanism to retrieve that, and probably you should be just using or implementing this particular interface into that particular class file, so that you can write the same method signature, but just that the way that you retrieve the data is going to be changing. So now you got the idea for this particular repository pattern, and all we need to do is we need to then use within our program.cs file. I will use that, and you will see there is going to be another error, because in ASP.NET, every time if you're going to be using any of these repository patterns or whatever it is, you are going to be adding that to a service, because this particular container that we have on the service needs to know what interface that you are going to be implementing. You're not going to be creating like a new something like a iData repository. Data repository is equal to new of the data repository, something like that. You're not really creating any of the instance anywhere. So in order to put that particular object within the service container of the .NET, we need to somehow do what is called as a dependency injection within the inversion of control. So in order to do that, we need to call what is called as the builder.service. But probably what I'm going to do is I'm just not going to do that for now. Just gonna get rid of that. Let's get rid of all the codes and then change the implementations, and then you will see the error, and then we'll fix that. So now I'm gonna remove this concrete employee DB context. It's too heavy because it's very much on the entity framework. So we're going to be removing that. And then I'm going to call the iData repository, something like that. And it's going to be DB. So that's the only change which I'm going to be doing. Let's put them all over here. Something like this. And you can see that this one, I think I have to do the get of a specific employee, which I have not did that yet. Probably I need to write that implementation as well. So let's go to the data repository. Public, is it going to be getting just an employee? get employee by ID, something like that. And then I'm gonna be passing that ID, which is gonna be string of ID, I think. And we're gonna pass the exact same thing. So let's copy this code and paste it over here. So the ID is going to be capital ID. Cool. So we have this implementation, which looks good. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call the return db dot. I'm just going to call this get employee by ID. And you know what? We need to do this implementation on the repository as well, because it doesn't really have that. So employee, smart. The Visual Studio's 2022's IntelliSense is very smarter. It tells me what I'm really going to be doing there, which is cool. I think it's looking good, but for some reason, why is that error still coming through here? Implement the interface. Why is that? Oh, okay. So it's looking for the integer. No, that's not integer. It's basically a string. All right. So now the error should have been gone. And now if I just do get employee by ID, and then I can just pass the ID, and this looks good. So you can see that we have removed that concrete implementation and also the business logic. All we're going to do is just call this dot get employees, something like this, and we are done. And over here, if I want to really update something, I can just get rid of all these things. So I can just say db dot put employees of that particular employee that we are passing in as a parameter on the body. And then similarly, I can just do return of db dot post, which is going to be add employee of the employee that I am passing in. That's it. So that's the only change that I'm going to be doing. And you can see that the code looks super clean and super neat this time. And this makes our code looks much better than before. It's very smaller in size because we have made those logics over there. So let's try to run this code and see if this code actually works fine without any problem. So the application is starting over here, and let's try to get all the employees. Why not? So employee 1, what about that? Oops, we get an error. You will see that this is what is the error I was talking about. The I repository that we have is not registered anywhere. What does that mean, basically? Well, that's what I was talking about. This particular iData repository has to be registered within the container. If not, aspnetcore doesn't really understand what is this guy that we are talking about over here within this service that we are passing in as a Lambda parameter. So what we need to do is we need to add this services dot add scope, and over here I'm going to add the iData repository and its concrete implementation, which is going to be the data repository. So every time if I'm going to call this iData repository anywhere within the code, then it's going to refer its data repository or its concrete implementation. So if you have any other data repository, something like a Postgres data repository, something like that, just for example, then if you register that in the scope over here, that's what is going to be called. So at the moment, we have only the data repositories. That's what's going to be called while we call this particular code. So now if I try running this code, you will see the code should hopefully works fine without any problem. So if I just do an employee of 1 this time, you will see that it is talking to the database and it retrieves the employee, which is going to be Karthik, which is all good. And then if I try doing something like all the employees, so you get all the employees coming up, which is all super cool. So the put and the other operation that we have over here is also going to work fine without any problem, and I don't really doubt on that. So this is how we could actually use or work with the repository pattern with ASP.NET Core 6.0 with minimal API and also using Entity Framework within our code. So that's it, guys. This is how we can simplify our code. In our next video, we can see how we can actually even more simplify the whole view of all these what is called as the services to be displayed using Swagger, which is already supported in ASP.NET Web API.